Number 1. Michael Jackson. It is often said that heavy lies the head that wears the crown, but for the man who is arguably the most famous human being on the planet, that crown was forged from pure gold and studded with diamonds, yet it weighed him down until he could no longer stand. When we think of fame, when we think of the absolute pinnacle of stardom, there is one name that eclipses all others. He was a figure so transcendent that he seemed to belong to a different species entirely, a being of rhythm and magic who could moonwalk across the stages of the world and make millions faint with a mere tilt of his fedora. To the outside world, Michael Jackson was an empire unto himself. He was the king of pop, a man whose career earnings reportedly soared past the $2 billion mark, a figure so astronomical that it is difficult for the average person to even comprehend. We watched him live in a fantasy world of his own creation, a literal playground of amusement parks and exotic animals, assuming that the fountain of wealth was as eternal as his music. But as we peel back the velvet curtain of this American tragedy, we find that the glittering image was a fortress built on shifting sands. Before we step further into the shadows of these fallen stars, if you want to journey with us through the hidden histories of fame and fortune, make sure you are subscribed to our channel, because the stories we are uncovering reveal the fragile humanity behind the headlines. With Michael, the humanity was often lost in the spectacle. We saw the sequined glove, the gold records, and the sold-out stadiums. We calculated the royalties from the best-selling album in history, Thriller, and assumed he was insulated from the mundane financial worries that plague ordinary lives. How could a man who bought the publishing rights to the Beatles catalog possibly worry about paying the bills? It seemed impossible. It seemed like a contradiction in terms. Yet the reality was a slow-motion car crash that had been accelerating for years, hidden behind the high walls of privacy and the blinding flashbulbs of the paparazzi. By the time the new millennium arrived, the cracks in the foundation were already widening into chasms. The man who had revolutionized the music industry was quietly drowning. It wasn't just about spending money, it was about a lifestyle that had become a runaway train, fueled by a need to fill a void that no amount of applause could ever satisfy. We looked at him and saw a billionaire, but his accountants looked at the ledgers and saw a disaster waiting to happen. The tragedy of Michael Jackson isn't just that he died, it is that he died chasing a financial salvation that had become a mirage. He was running a race against interest rates and ballooning expenses, a race that would ultimately cost him everything.
To understand the magnitude of the collapse, we have to look at the centerpiece of his life and his debt, Neverland Ranch. It was more than a home. It was a physical manifestation of his psyche, a sprawling 2,700-acre utopia in Santa Barbara County designed to keep the harsh realities of the adult world at bay. But utopias are expensive to maintain. The cost of running Neverland was staggering, estimated at nearly $5 million a year just for basic maintenance. This included a full-time staff of dozens, the upkeep of amusement park rides, the care and feeding of a private zoo, and the manicured grounds that looked like perpetual springtime. For decades, Michael treated his income like an infinite resource. He shopped with the ferocity of a king acquiring treasures for a palace, dropping millions on antiques, art, and trinkets in single shopping sprees. But as the hits slowed down and the legal battles began to mount, the cash flow that had once been a torrent turned into a trickle. Yet the spending did not stop. To maintain the illusion of the king of pop, he turned to lenders. He borrowed against his most valuable assets, using his stake in the Sony ATV music catalog as collateral for loans totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a high-stakes gamble, leveraging his legacy to pay for his present. By the mid-2000s, the interest payments alone on his debts were suffocating. He was living on borrowed time and borrowed dimes. The sanctuary of Neverland became a prison of debt. He was reportedly facing foreclosure on the very gates that were supposed to protect him. The isolation was palpable. He was surrounded by handlers and sycophants, yet financially he was cornered. This context transforms our understanding of his final days in 2009. The This Is It residency at the O2 Arena in London wasn't just a triumphant return to the stage for the love of performing. It was a desperate, necessary act of survival. He needed the cash. He needed to stop the bleeding. The pressure on his frail shoulders was immense. He wasn't just rehearsing choreography. He was fighting to save his assets, his home, and his dignity. Every spin, every vocal run during those grueling rehearsals was weighted with the knowledge that if this tour didn't happen, the house of cards would collapse. He was a man accustomed to perfection, now forced to perform by the cold, hard logic of compound interest. The anxiety must have been paralyzing, driving the insomnia that led him to seek the chemical sleep that would ultimately claim his life. He was the most famous man on earth, yet he was trapped in a room of mirrors, unable to find a way out without shattering the image he had spent a lifetime building.
When the news broke on June 25, 2009, the world stopped spinning. The internet crashed. Crowds gathered outside the UCLA Medical Center and the Apollo Theater, weeping for the icon they had lost. But as the initial wave of grief subsided and the probate lawyers stepped in to untangle the web of his estate, a shocking truth emerged from the paperwork. The king of pop, the man who had generated billions of dollars in revenue throughout his career, died roughly $500 million in debt, $500 million in the red. It was a figure that defied logic. How could someone who owned the rights to the soundtrack of our lives be technically insolvent? The forensic accounting revealed a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. His assets were valuable, certainly. The music catalogs were worth a fortune, but they were leveraged to the hilt. He was cash poor and drowning in liabilities. The This Is It tour, which was supposed to be his financial lifeboat, became the final footnote in a story of excess and sorrow. In the years following his death, his estate would eventually generate huge sums, paying off the debts and restoring his fortune for his children. But Michael himself never saw that solvency. He died in a rented mansion, surrounded by medical equipment, stressed about money, chasing sleep that wouldn't come. He passed away believing he was on the brink of ruin. The tragedy is that he spent his final moments not basking in the glory of his achievements, but suffocating under the weight of his obligations. It forces us to ask, what is the price of a legacy? Michael Jackson gave the world everything: his childhood, his privacy, his health, and ultimately his life. In return, the machinery of fame chewed him up and spat him out, leaving him to navigate a labyrinth of creditors alone in the dark. His story is the ultimate cautionary tale of how quickly the unimaginable wealth of Hollywood can evaporate when the lights go down. But sadly, he was not the only musical titan to find that a golden voice offers no protection against the demons of finance and addiction. We leave the pop charts behind now and head to a luxurious hotel suite in Beverly Hills, where another voice, one that could move mountains and melt hearts, was silenced in a bathtub, leaving behind not just a legacy of hits, but a heartbreaking trail of lost millions and borrowed cash. Number 2. Whitney Houston. We arrive at the Beverly Hilton, an institution of Hollywood glamour where the hallways whisper with the secrets of the rich and famous, only to find that the golden voice which once soared higher than any other has been silenced forever. When we talk about vocal talent, about the kind of gift that comes along perhaps once in a generation, there is no conversation that does not begin and end with Whitney Houston. She was simply the voice. To hear her sing was to witness something divine, a perfect instrument that could navigate the most complex gospel runs and the most powerful pop ballads with effortless grace. She was the golden girl of the music industry, a princess of pop royalty who seemed destined for a life of unending applause and limitless wealth. In 2001, she signed the biggest record deal in music history at the time with Arista Records, a contract worth $100 million. Over the course of her storied career, she generated an estimated $250 million in earnings. She was an industry unto herself, crossing over from music to blockbuster films like The Bodyguard, creating a cultural footprint that was as deep as it was wide. But the tragedy of Whitney Houston is not just the loss of a talent, it is the agonizing, public dismantling of an icon. We watched her transformation in real time, from the fresh-faced girl from Newark, New Jersey, into a tabloid fixture, her personal struggles splashed across magazine covers for the world to consume. Yet, even as the headlines turned cruel, we assumed the fortune was secure. We assumed that the royalties from I Will Always Love You, a song that played at nearly every wedding and prom for a decade, would keep her insulated from financial ruin. How could the woman who sold over 200 million records possibly worry about money? It seemed inconceivable that the well could ever run dry. However, behind the scenes, the economics of her life were chaotic.
The money came in waves, massive and undeniable, but it went out in tsunamis. Whitney was known for her generosity, often supporting a vast entourage of family, friends, and hangers-on who relied on her payroll to fund their own lifestyles. She was the engine that kept a small economy running, and few around her had the courage or the incentive to tell her to slow down. The pressure to provide, to be the matriarch and the provider, created a dynamic where she was loved, yes, but also used. And when the personal demons of addiction began to take the wheel, the financial oversight vanished completely. The millions earned in the 90s were being burned to fuel a chaotic lifestyle in the 2000s, leaving the foundation of her wealth to rot from the inside out.
The descent was gradual, masked by the residual glow of her past achievements. Addiction is a thief that steals more than just health and relationships. It steals judgment. It robs you of the ability to see the future, trapping you in a perpetual, expensive present. For Whitney, the cost of addiction wasn't just the substances themselves, but the chaos that surrounded them, the missed dates, the canceled concerts, the legal battles, and the erratic behavior that made insurers and promoters wary of working with her. Her earning power, once the most potent force in entertainment, began to atrophy. The $100 million contract was an advance against future earnings, money that had to be recouped. But as her output slowed and her public image darkened, the math stopped working in her favor. She was living a life designed for a billionaire on the budget of a struggling artist. The mansions, the cars, the travel, it all remained, but the income required to sustain it had evaporated. There is a heartbreaking reality to the finances of a superstar in decline. The overhead does not shrink just because the hits stop coming. She was trapped in the machinery of her own fame. To the world, she was still Whitney Houston, the diva, and maintaining that facade required a level of expenditure that she simply could no longer afford. Reports surfaced of unpaid bills, of mortgages in default, and of a frantic shuffling of assets to keep the lights on. It was a humiliating slide for a woman who had once commanded the highest fees in the industry. By the time she attempted her comebacks, the sparkle in her eyes had been replaced by a weary sadness. The voice, battered by years of smoking and strain, was a shadow of its former self. Watching her struggle to hit the high notes that once came so easily was a visceral reminder of what had been lost. But she kept trying, pushed not just by a love for music, but by the crushing weight of necessity. She needed the money. The vultures were circling, and the debts were mounting. The tragedy is that she was surrounded by people, yet financially she was incredibly isolated, facing a mountain of obligations that no amount of goodwill could pay. The empire she had built with her breath and her soul was crumbling, brick by brick, while the world watched and wondered what had gone wrong. On February 11, 2012, the end came in a guest room at the Beverly Hilton on the eve of the Grammy Awards. The music industry had gathered downstairs to celebrate its biggest night, a cruel juxtaposition to the lonely scene unfolding a few floors above. When the coroner's van finally pulled away, taking the voice to the morgue, the forensic accountants were left to sift through the wreckage of her estate. The numbers were shocking. The woman who had generated $250 million died approximately $20 million in debt. The rumors that swirled in the aftermath were even more gut-wrenching. Stories that in her final days she had been forced to ask friends for as little as $100 just to get by. It is a thought that chills the blood. Whitney Houston, one of the best-selling music artists of all time, reduced to borrowing cash like a broke college student. Her fortune had been devoured by bad investments, predatory contracts, excessive generosity, and the relentless drain of addiction. She had sung about having nothing if she didn't have love, but in the end she had neither the money nor the peace she so desperately deserved. Her estate would eventually recover, buoyed by the posthumous surge in record sales that always accompanies the death of a legend, but that does not erase the terror of her final reality. She died knowing she was broke. She died in the shadow of the very industry that had made her rich, listening to the muffled sounds of a party she would never attend. Her story forces us to look in the mirror and question the nature of success. We think of wealth as a fortress, but for Whitney, it was a cage.
She was a victim of her own generosity and her own pain, a star who burned so brightly that she consumed herself completely. We mourn the voice, but we should also mourn the woman who was left defenseless against the cold arithmetic of bankruptcy. But as we leave the tragedy of the Beverly Hilton behind, we must travel back in time, away from the pop charts and into the black and white era of Hollywood's golden age. Our next subject was a man who spent nearly 90 years in show business, a child star who became the biggest box office draw on earth, only to find that the greatest betrayal would come not from strangers, but from the very family he sat with at the dinner table.
Number 3. Mickey Rooney. We step now into the flickering light of Hollywood's golden age, where a diminutive powerhouse with an oversized personality captured the hearts of America for nearly 9 decades. Mickey Rooney was more than an actor. He was a force of nature, a child prodigy who seamlessly transitioned into the biggest box office draw on the planet. In the late 1930s and early 40s, there was no star shining brighter. He was the quintessential American boy, the Andy Hardy who could solve any problem and charm any girl. For 3 consecutive years, he was the #1 money-making star in the world, eclipsing giants like Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy. His career spanned from the silent era to the digital age, a feat of longevity that is virtually unmatched in the history of cinema. He appeared in over 300 films, won accolades, married 8 times, and generated millions of dollars in revenue for the studios that built their fortunes on his back. By any measure, he should have died a titan of industry, resting on a mountain of wealth accumulated over a lifetime of tireless work. But the tragedy of Mickey Rooney is a slow-burning fuse that exploded not with a bang, but with a whimper of betrayal. We watched him grow old on screen, assuming that the mischievous twinkle in his eye was a reflection of a life well lived and well rewarded. We saw the honorary Oscar, the countless talk show appearances, and the reverence with which he was treated by younger generations of actors. It seemed impossible that the man who had been the face of MGM could ever want for anything. He was Hollywood royalty, a living link to a bygone era of glamour and excess. Yet, behind the scenes, the reality was a nightmare of exploitation that would make a Shakespearean tragedy look tame. The money, estimated at over $12 million in lifetime earnings, a staggering sum when adjusted for inflation, vanished into thin air. It wasn't just bad investments or lavish spending that drained his accounts. It was something far more insidious. Mickey Rooney, the man who had entertained millions, became a prisoner in his own life, surrounded by people who saw him not as a father or a husband, but as a walking ATM. As his health declined and his vulnerability increased, the sharks began to circle, and the most painful bite came from within his own home. He was a victim of elder abuse, financial mismanagement, and a systematic draining of his assets that left him powerless to stop the bleeding.
To understand the depth of this betrayal, we have to look at his final years. Mickey was still working, still hustling, taking roles in films like Night at the Museum well into his 80s. But the money he earned wasn't going into a retirement fund. It was being siphoned off. Reports surfaced of him being denied access to his own finances, of being controlled and manipulated by those closest to him, specifically his stepson. He testified before the U.S. Senate about the horrors of elder abuse, a frail old man pleading for protection from the very people who were supposed to care for him. It was a heartbreaking spectacle. The man who had once commanded the screen with boundless energy was now reduced to a trembling figure, admitting that he was scared and broke. He was trapped in a cycle of dependency. His assets were mismanaged, his earnings were diverted, and his autonomy was stripped away. The millions he had made over a lifetime of entertaining were gone, lost to a combination of his own trusting nature and the predatory greed of those around him. He spoke of being left with nothing, of being unable to buy food or pay for medication. It is a chilling reminder that fame offers no immunity against the cruelty of family. The adoration of fans could not pay the bills, and the legacy of his films could not protect him from the indignity of poverty. By the time he reached his 90s, the situation was dire. He was living on a meager Social Security check and the kindness of strangers. The fortune he had amassed, the wealth that should have secured a comfortable and dignified end, had been completely eroded. He was forced to continue working not out of passion, but out of necessity, a 90-year-old man still dancing for his supper. The humiliation must have been crushing. To have been the biggest star in the world and end up destitute is a fall from grace that is hard to comprehend. It speaks to a profound failure of the systems meant to protect our most vulnerable, even when those vulnerable people are legends.
When Mickey Rooney died in April 2014 at the age of 93, the final accounting of his life was a shock to the system. The man who had been the top box office draw in the world, whose career had generated untold millions for Hollywood, died with a reported $18,000 to his name. $18,000. It was barely enough to cover the cost of a modest funeral. The disparity between his contribution to cinema and his financial reality at the end is one of the most tragic statistics in Hollywood history. He left behind a legacy of laughter and joy, but his personal story ended in tears and poverty. His death sparked legal battles over his remains and his meager estate, a final indignity for a man who deserved so much better. The tragedy is that he spent his final years in fear, worrying about money, and feeling the sting of betrayal from those he loved. He died broke, not because he was reckless, but because he was robbed. He was a victim of a crime that often goes unpunished, a crime that happens behind closed doors and leaves no physical bruises, only a shattered spirit and an empty bank account. His story is a stark warning about the vulnerability of the elderly and the transient nature of wealth. It forces us to question who we can trust when the spotlight fades and the infirmities of age set in. Mickey Rooney gave us everything, but in the end, he was left with almost nothing. But as we close the book on this Hollywood legend, we must prepare ourselves for another tale of immense talent and immense tragedy. We turn now to a woman whose voice could silence a room, and whose ruby slippers walked her into immortality, yet who found herself homeless and haunting the very city that had crowned her its queen.
Number 4. Judy Garland. If Mickey Rooney was the energetic prince of the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer lot, then the woman standing next to him, often singing her heart out in a barn or dreaming of a land somewhere over the rainbow, was its undeniable queen. We cannot tell the story of Hollywood's cruelty without kneeling at the altar of Judy Garland. To the world, she was Dorothy Gale, the innocent girl in the blue gingham dress who taught us that there is no place like home. She was the voice of a generation, a talent so raw and so powerful that she could bring an audience of thousands to tears with a single note. She was the biggest female star of her era, a woman whose films generated millions upon millions of dollars for the studio machine that owned her. But behind the Technicolor dreams and the ruby slippers lay a reality so dark, so exploitative, that it shattered her long before she ever had a chance to be whole. Judy was not just an actress, she was a commodity. From childhood, she was fed a diet of amphetamines to keep her working 18-hour days and barbiturates to knock her out at night, a chemical cocktail prescribed by the very studio executives who were profiting from her labor. We watched her grow up on screen, marveling at her vibrato and her vulnerability, never realizing that the vulnerability was not acting, it was a cry for help. She earned a fortune during her tenure at MGM, commanding fees that were astronomical for the time. She was the gold standard of entertainment. Yet the tragedy of Judy Garland is that she was an artist who created immense wealth for others while being systematically robbed of her own security. By the time she reached adulthood, the financial structure of her life was already collapsing under the weight of her addictions and the mismanagement of the men in her life. She was surrounded by agents, managers, and husbands who viewed her as a natural resource to be mined rather than a person to be protected. The money flowed in, oh, how it flowed, from concerts at Carnegie Hall to television specials that broke ratings records, but it flowed out just as quickly into the pockets of the IRS, into the hands of embezzlers, and into the bottomless pit of medical bills and hotels. We assumed that the legend who could command a standing ovation just by walking onto a stage was living in a palace. We assumed that the world's greatest entertainer was insulated by a fortress of cash. But the heartbreaking truth is that for Judy, the applause was often the only currency she had left.
The unraveling of her finances was a slow, agonizing public spectacle. As her reliability on set waned due to the addiction the studio had instilled in her,
Her earning power became erratic. She was fired from films, sued for breach of contract, and labeled difficult by the very industry that had broken her. Yet she kept working. She had to. The concerts were not just artistic triumphs. They were frantic attempts to pay off back taxes and keep the wolves at bay. She was a woman running on a treadmill that was moving too fast, chasing a solvency that remained perpetually out of reach. The cruel irony is that while her voice was aging like fine wine, gaining a depth and pathos that was unmatched, her bank account was hemorrhaging. By the late 1960s, the situation had become desperate. The IRS was garnishing her wages, seizing her earnings before she could even touch them. The home she had fought so hard to keep, the sanctuary for her children, had to be sold. It is a devastating image. Judy Garland, the woman who sang about the comforts of home more poignantly than anyone in history, was effectively homeless. She was bouncing between rental properties, relying on the hospitality of friends, and living out of suitcases. The instability was crushing. She was a nomad in a city she had once ruled, a queen in exile within her own kingdom. The press, often cruel and unforgiving, documented her stumbles and her frail appearance, but they rarely looked at the ledger. They didn't see the liens or the lawsuits. They didn't see a woman who was working herself to death just to keep a roof over her head. The psychological toll of this financial insecurity was immense. How does one reconcile being an icon, a legend, a household name, with the reality of not knowing if you can pay the rent next month? The cognitive dissonance must have been maddening. She was trapped in a cycle of performing to pay off debts, only to incur new ones, a hamster wheel of fame and poverty that ground her down until there was nothing left but the nerves and the voice.
In June 1969, the final curtain fell in a rented mews house in London. Judy Garland was just 47 years old. When the news crossed the Atlantic, the world mourned the loss of a national treasure. But as the eulogies were read and the retrospective reels played on television, the probate court revealed the stark, cold reality of her existence. The woman whose films had grossed millions died roughly $4 million in debt. $4 million. It was a mountain of obligation that she had carried on her small frame for years. She had been forced to sell her personal possessions, her jewelry, and even her furniture in a desperate bid to satisfy the taxman and her creditors. Her estate was insolvent. There was nothing left to give but her legacy. The Wizard of Oz continues to generate millions every year, but Judy died worrying about the grocery bill. Her death was not just a tragedy of addiction, it was a tragedy of financial exploitation. She was a worker who was used up and discarded, a star who burned out trying to keep the lights on. She died in a rented bathroom, far from the Hollywood hills she had conquered, leaving behind a family that would have to fight for years to regain control of her image and her earnings. The system had won. It had extracted every ounce of value from her talent and left her with nothing but the dust. Her story is the ultimate indictment of the studio system and the parasitic nature of fame. It teaches us that talent is no guarantee of security, and that the brightest stars often cast the longest, darkest shadows. Judy Garland gave us dreams, but she lived a nightmare of insecurity. But as we leave the tragic ruby slippers behind, we must turn our gaze to the neon lights of Las Vegas. We are looking for a man who defined cool, a member of the most exclusive club in show business, a man who broke racial barriers with a smile and a tap dance, yet found himself staring down the barrel of the most feared government agency in America, the IRS, with absolutely no way out.
Number 5. Sammy Davis Jr. The neon lights of the Las Vegas Strip flicker like a mirage in the desert heat, promising fortune to the lucky and ruin to the reckless. In the center of this electric oasis stood a man who was arguably the greatest entertainer who ever lived. A dynamo of talent who could tap dance like a machine gun, sing with the soul of a preacher, and impersonate anyone in Hollywood with uncanny precision. Sammy Davis Jr. was Mr. Show Business. As a core member of the Rat Pack, alongside Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, he defined the very concept of cool for a generation. He broke racial barriers, not with a protest sign, but with a tuxedo and a smile,
walking through the front doors of casinos but had previously only allowed men of his color to enter through the kitchen. He was a trailblazer who earned millions upon millions of dollars, commanding fees that made him one of the highest-paid performers on the planet. To watch Sammy on stage at the Sands was to witness pure, unadulterated energy. He was a man who lived at a velocity that few could comprehend, fueled by a desperate need to be loved and accepted. And the money? It flowed like the champagne in his dressing room. He lived a life of unapologetic excess, buying gold, jewelry, cars, and gifts for friends with a generosity that bordered on the pathological. He wanted to pick up every check, host every party, and be the man who provided for everyone around him. It was part of the persona, the armor he wore to protect himself from the stinging indignities of racism he faced off stage. If he was the richest, the most generous, the most impeccably dressed man in the room, perhaps they wouldn't see his skin color. They would only see the star. But the economy of cool is expensive, extremely expensive. Sammy's spending was legendary, but his financial management was practically non-existent. He trusted people to handle the boring details of taxes and investments while he focused on the show. He poured money into tax shelters that turned out to be hollow, and he neglected the one partner who never forgets and never forgets, the Internal Revenue Service. As the 1970s rolled into the 80s, the landscape of entertainment changed. The Rat Pack era faded into nostalgia, but Sammy's lifestyle remained locked in the high-rolling 60s. He was earning a fortune, yes, but he was spending two fortunes to maintain the image of the Candyman, the superstar who had it all. The cracks in the facade were invisible to the audience, but behind the curtain, the pressure was mounting. He was running a race against his own overhead, a race that was becoming impossible to win.
The turning point was not a sudden crash, but a slow, suffocating constriction. The IRS began to take notice of the irregularities, the missed payments, and the questionable deductions. The tax debt began to snowball, compounding with interest and penalties until it became a leviathan that threatened to swallow him whole. Yet, Sammy kept working. He had to. He toured relentlessly, pushing his body to the limit, driven by the terrifying knowledge that if he stopped singing, the house of cards would fall. Then came the diagnosis that silenced the music: throat cancer. For a man whose voice was his currency, this was the ultimate catastrophe. The treatment required surgery that would effectively end his singing career. He was faced with a brutal choice: his voice or his life. He chose life, but the cost was astronomical. Without the ability to command the huge fees from concerts and Vegas residencies, his income plummeted, but the debt remained, looming larger than ever. The medical bills piled up alongside the tax liens, creating a perfect storm of financial ruin. He was the man who had given the world, "I've gotta be me," but now he was struggling just to be solvent. The final years of his life were a tragic paradox. He was feted with awards, honored by presidents, and celebrated as a living legend on television specials, yet privately, he was drowning. He was a national treasure who was technically bankrupt. The stress of the debt weighed heavily on him as his health deteriorated. He watched as the IRS circled, knowing that he would leave his beloved wife, Altavis, with a mess that was too big to clean up. It is a heartbreaking image. The man who had brought so much joy to millions, lying in his Beverly Hills home, surrounded by the trophies of his success, yet paralyzed by the fear of what the taxman would do once he was gone. He had spent a lifetime trying to buy acceptance and security, only to find that the government's ledger was the only score that truly mattered in the end.
When Sammy Davis Jr. passed away in May 1990, the lights of Las Vegas were dimmed in his honor, a tribute to the man who had helped build the city's reputation. But back in the real world, the lights were being turned off for a different reason. The reading of the will revealed a financial disaster. The estate of the legendary entertainer was not just empty, it was underwater. Sammy died owing the IRS more than $5 million, a debt that eclipsed the value of his assets. The situation was so dire that his wife was eventually forced to auction off his personal memorabilia just to make a dent in the liability. It was a humiliating postscript to a glorious career. The tuxedos he wore, the instruments he played, the gold records on his walls, all of it went under the hammer. Fans and collectors picked through the artifacts of his life, buying pieces of a legend who had died penniless. The Candyman could make the sun rise, but he couldn't make the tax debt disappear. His story serves as a brutal reminder that talent and fame are not the same as wealth and security. You can be the most beloved entertainer in the world, you can have the president on speed dial, but if the math doesn't add up, the system will strip you bare. Sammy Davis Jr. gave his heart and soul to the audience, but he left his family with a burden that took years to resolve. His tragedy teaches us that the applause eventually stops, but the bills keep coming. We leave the glitz of the Vegas Strip now, turning away from the high-stakes world of adult superstars to the bright, artificial colors of a 1980s television set. We are tuning into a sitcom where a small boy with a big personality and a famous catchphrase charmed a world, never realizing that while the laugh track played, the people he trusted most, his own parents, were quietly stealing his future, dollar by dollar.
Number 6. Gary Coleman. The laughter of a studio audience is a strange thing. It sounds like joy, but often it is merely a recording of ghosts, a mechanical response to a script that hides the tears of the performers. When we tune in to the static-filled memories of the late 1970s and early 80s, one face dominates the screen. A small boy with cheeks that seemed designed for pinching, and a catchphrase that became a global phenomenon. "What you talking about, Willis?" was not just a line, it was a cultural currency that made Gary Coleman the highest-paid child star on television. As the star of Different Strokes, he was an adorable, pint-sized powerhouse who could outact seasoned veterans with a single look. He was the golden goose of NBC, generating ratings that kept the network afloat and merchandise sales that filled toy stores across America. Over the course of the show's run, Gary Coleman earned a staggering $18 million. It was a fortune that should have set him up for life, a financial fortress built on the innocence of his childhood. But the tragedy of Gary Coleman is a story of biological betrayal so profound that it makes the fictional dramas of television seem trivial. We watched the Drummond family on screen, a wealthy, benevolent father figure adopting 2 boys from Harlem, and we believed in the fairy tale of rescue and love. We assumed that off-screen, Gary's real parents were safeguarding his interests, protecting their son's future with the same ferocity that the character Mr. Drummond showed for Arnold. We were wrong. While the cameras rolled and the audience roared with laughter, the people charged with Gary's care, his own mother and father, along with his business advisors, were quietly dismantling his empire. The theft was not a sudden heist, it was a slow, systematic draining of his accounts. They treated his earnings as a family slush fund, paying themselves exorbitant salaries, buying cars, and living a lifestyle that Gary himself was too young to understand or authorize. The trust fund that was supposed to be his safety net, his reward for a childhood spent on a soundstage under hot lights, was being raided from within. By the time Gary reached adulthood and the show was canceled, the harsh reality set in. The phone stopped ringing, the residuals were not enough, and when he finally looked at the books, the $18 million had vanished. He was a young man with a chronic kidney condition that stunted his growth, trapped in a body that the world still saw as a child's, facing a financial landscape that had been scorched by the very people who gave him life. The legal battle that followed was ugly and heartbreaking. In 1989, Gary sued his parents and his former manager for misappropriation of funds. It was a public spectacle that shattered the illusion of the happy child star. He won the lawsuit, securing a judgment of nearly $1.3 million. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The bulk of the money was already gone, spent on legal fees and the years of lavish living by his handlers. The emotional toll of suing one's own parents is incalculable. It severed the most fundamental bond a human being has, leaving him isolated and adrift in a world that only valued him as a prop. The post-childhood years were a cruel descent into parody and struggle. Hollywood is notoriously unkind to child stars who grow up. But for Gary, the rejection was compounded by his medical issues and his unique physical stature. He couldn't transition into leading man roles. He was forever frozen in the public consciousness as Arnold Jackson. The work dried up. The millions were a distant memory. To survive, the man who had once been the most famous face in America took a job as a security guard. It was a humiliating necessity. Imagine the psychological weight of standing in a uniform, protecting a mall or a film set, while passersby mock you with your own catchphrase, unaware that you are working just to eat. In 1999, the inevitable happened. Gary Coleman filed for bankruptcy. The documents revealed a life of meager existence, a stark contrast to the opulence of his peak years. He was drowning in debt, owing money to creditors for basic living expenses. The Coogan Law, designed to protect child actors' earnings in California, had failed him, or rather, the loopholes and the sheer avarice of his guardians had circumvented it. He became a punchline for late-night comedians, a tragic figure who appeared in reality shows and cameos that mocked his former glory simply because he needed the paycheck. The laughter had turned predatory. We weren't laughing with him anymore. The culture was laughing at him, while he struggled to maintain his dignity in the face of insurmountable financial ruin.
The end of Gary Coleman's life was as chaotic and sad as his adulthood. His health, always fragile due to the congenital kidney disease that required daily dialysis and multiple transplants, began to fail critically. He suffered seizures on the sets of the few low-budget productions that would hire him. He was a man physically and emotionally exhausted, fighting a battle on two fronts, against his own body and against a world that refused to let him grow up or move on. On May 28, 2010, Gary Coleman died after being taken off life support following a fall at his home. He was 42 years old. At the time of his death, the man who had generated an $18 million fortune was virtually destitute. There were reports that his estate had almost no assets, sparking yet another legal battle over his remains and his meager possessions. He didn't even have a will that could be easily executed, leading to a feud between his estranged parents and his ex-wife. It was a final, chaotic chapter in a life defined by conflict over money he no longer had. Gary Coleman's story is perhaps the darkest indictment of the child star industry. It forces us to ask, who protects the children when the parents are the predators? He gave his childhood to the screen, bringing joy to millions. But in return, he was stripped of his fortune, his family, and his peace. He died a broke, lonely man, a cautionary tale of how quickly the industry and the people closest to you can devour a life. But as we leave the tragic sitcom set behind, we must travel further back in time, to an era of black and white noir and smoke-filled rooms. We are looking for a woman with a signature peekaboo hairstyle, a blonde bombshell who captivated a nation and defined the femme fatale, only to vanish into the shadows, eventually found working as a cocktail waitress in a cheap hotel, unrecognized by the very people who had once paid to see her face on the silver screen.
Number 7. Veronica Lake. The silhouette of a woman with a cascade of platinum blonde hair obscuring one eye is one of the most enduring images in the history of cinema. It is a visual shorthand for mystery, danger, and allure. In the early 1940s, there was no star who embodied the concept of the femme fatale more perfectly than Veronica Lake. She was a phenomenon, a creation of the studio system that was so successful, so captivating, that the War Department reportedly asked her to change her hairstyle because female factory workers were injuring themselves in machinery while trying to copy her iconic peekaboo look. At her peak, she was one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood, earning $4,500 a week, a fortune in an era when the average American family earned less than that in 2 years. She starred alongside giants like Alan Ladd in noir classics such as This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia, films that defined a genre and generated millions in box office revenue. To the public, she was an untouchable goddess of the silver screen, a woman whose cool, detached demeanor suggested she held all the cards and all the cash. But the tragedy of Veronica Lake is a study in how quickly Hollywood can create a monster and then destroy it. We watched her navigate the treacherous underworld of film noir, always one step ahead of the detectives and the gangsters, and we assumed that her off-screen life mirrored that control. We imagined her living in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills, surrounded by servants and admirers, her financial future secured by the massive profits she brought to Paramount Pictures. Yet the reality was a chaotic freefall.
The peekaboo girl was grappling with demons that the studio press agents worked overtime to hide. Undiagnosed mental illness, likely schizophrenia, combined with a fierce, combative personality to make her a pariah on the lot. She was labeled difficult, a death sentence for an actress in the studio era. The money, which had flowed in rivers during the war years, began to evaporate as quickly as it arrived. Veronica was not a businesswoman. She was a star, and like many stars of her time, she was subjected to controlling contracts and personal turmoil that bled her dry. Her earnings were decimated by 3 failed marriages, erratic spending fueled by alcoholism, and a generosity that was often exploited by those around her. By the time the 1950s arrived, the phone had stopped ringing. The studio that had manufactured her image discarded her when the trends changed and her behavior became too much to handle. The woman who had once been the most popular pinup for GIs overseas was suddenly unemployable, her fortune dissolved in a haze of liquor and litigation.
The descent from the Hollywood A-list to the bottom of the bottle was brutal and swift. Veronica Lake didn't just fade away, she crashed. By the early 60s, the money was completely gone. The mansions were sold, the furs were pawned, and the glamorous circle of friends had vanished. She drifted from cheap hotel to cheap hotel, a ghost haunting the very industry that had made her famous. It is a harrowing image. The woman whose face had once been plastered on billboards across America was now unrecognizable, her legendary beauty ravaged by years of hard drinking and neglect. In a twist of fate that seems almost too cruel for fiction, a reporter in New York City discovered her working as a cocktail waitress and bartender at a lowly hotel in Manhattan. She wasn't doing it for research or for a role, she was doing it to survive. When the story broke, it was a sensation. The fallen star, the headline screamed. Fans sent her money, shocked that their idol was serving drinks to strangers for tips. But the charity was a temporary bandage on a gaping wound. The pride that had made her a star also made it difficult for her to accept help or change her trajectory. She was trapped in a spiral of self-destruction, her liver failing and her mind fraying at the edges. The tragedy of her financial ruin was compounded by her isolation. She had alienated her children and her mother, burning bridges with the same intensity she had once burned up the screen. There were no residuals to save her, no back-end points on the movies that were now playing on late-night television. She was a worker in a gig economy before the term existed, living paycheck to paycheck, her past glory serving only as a painful reminder of what she had lost. The industry that continues to profit from her image today, selling posters and merchandise of the peekaboo girl, left the real woman to rot in poverty.
In July 1973, Veronica Lake died in a hospital in Burlington, Vermont, from hepatitis and acute kidney injury. She was only 50 years old. The woman who had been a top earner in Hollywood, whose films had grossed millions, died penniless. She was so destitute that she had no money for a funeral. Her body remained in a funeral home for days, unclaimed and unpaid for, until a friend finally stepped forward to cover the costs of her cremation. It was a final, devastating indignity for a woman who had once been the toast of the town. Her ashes sat on a shelf for 3 years before being scattered off the coast of Florida, a forgotten end for a screen legend. The contrast between the femme fatale who could destroy men with a look and the frail, impoverished woman who died alone in a hospital bed is heartbreaking. Veronica Lake was a victim of a system that chewed up young women and spat them out the moment they showed a crack in the armor. She died broke because the machine of Hollywood had no use for a broken doll. She was a commodity that had expired, her value reduced to 0 in the ledger of the studio executives. Her story remains a stark warning about the ephemeral nature of beauty and fame. It teaches us that the image on the screen is a lie, a carefully constructed illusion that hides the very real human cost of stardom. But as we leave the tragic noir heroine behind, we must fast forward to a different era of excess, to the neon-soaked 1980s. We are looking for a teenage idol, one half of a famous duo, a boy with a crooked smile who adorned the bedroom walls of millions of girls, only to find himself trapped in a cycle of abuse and addiction that would leave him destitute and living with his mother, begging for a second chance that would never come.
Number 8. Haim. We arrive now in the neon-soaked excess of the 1980s,
a decade defined by synthesizers, hairspray, and the birth of the teen idol as a global commodity. If you walked into the bedroom of almost any teenage girl in North America during this era, you would find the walls plastered with the face of a boy with a crooked, mischievous smile and eyes that seemed to hold a secret. Corey Haim was not just an actor, he was a phenomenon. Alongside his best friend and frequent co-star Corey Feldman, he formed the Two Coreys, a brand that dominated the box office and the newsstands for years. Films like The Lost Boys, Lucas, and License to Drive were not just movies, they were cultural events that minted millions. At the height of his fame, Corey Haim was earning a reported $2,000 a week from residuals alone, on top of the six-figure salaries he commanded for film roles. He was the golden boy of a generation, a kid from Toronto who had conquered Hollywood before he could even legally drive. To the outside world, Corey Haim was living the ultimate teenage fantasy. He had the fame, the adoration, and the bank account to match. We saw him on the red carpets in oversized blazers, flashing that signature grin, and we assumed that the infrastructure of his life was solid. We calculated the box office receipts of The Lost Boys, over $32 million in the US alone, and figured that the points on the back end would keep him comfortable forever. How could the face of Teen Beat magazine possibly worry about rent? It seemed as unlikely as the sun failing to rise. He was a superstar in a decade that celebrated wealth, and he appeared to have it all. But the tragedy of Corey Haim is perhaps the most visceral example of how the entertainment industry consumes its young. The money that flowed in was substantial, but the ecosystem around him was predatory. He was a child navigating an adult world of sharks with little to no genuine protection. The earnings were not being invested in diversified portfolios or trust funds, they were burned. They were fuel for a lifestyle that was spiraling out of control before he even had a chance to grow up. The pressure to maintain the image of the heartthrob while dealing with the dark, unspoken traumas of his experiences in the industry created a fissure in his soul that money could not fill, but which money certainly helped to deepen.
The descent was agonizingly public. By the early 90s, the roles began to dry up. The industry that had once fought to cast him now viewed him as a liability. Addiction had taken hold, a ferocious beast that demanded to be fed with every dollar he had left. We watched him struggle in real time, his appearance changing, his speech slurring in interviews, a heartbreaking transformation from the bright-eyed boy of Lucas to a man clearly in pain. The financial cost of addiction is not just the price of the drugs, it is the lost opportunity cost of a destroyed reputation. Insurers wouldn't cover him, directors wouldn't hire him, and the income stream that had once seemed infinite turned into a drought. He filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in 1997, a shocking admission of defeat for a young man who had been a millionaire just a few years prior. The debts were overwhelming: medical bills from rehab stints, back taxes, and legal fees. He was living a nightmare where he was famous enough to be recognized everywhere he went, but too broke to afford a cup of coffee. There were reports of him attempting to sell his own hair and even a tooth on eBay just to generate cash. It was a level of desperation that made the public recoil. We didn't want to believe that the boy we loved was reduced to selling parts of himself to survive. It shattered the illusion of Hollywood glamour completely. He tried to stage comebacks, appearing in reality shows like The Two Coreys, but the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the star anymore. He was the tragedy. The reality TV paycheck was a lifeline, but it wasn't enough to repair decades of financial damage. He was trapped in a cycle of dependency, relying on his mother for housing and support. The millions he had earned in the 80s were a distant memory, a ghost story he told himself in the mirror. He was a man who had been chewed up by the machinery of fame and spit out with nothing but his demons. The isolation of his poverty was profound. He was a celebrity who was technically homeless without his family, a man who had once been the center of the universe, now living on the fringes of it.
On March 10, 2010, the end came in an apartment in Burbank, California, where Corey Haim was living with his mother, Judy. He collapsed and was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead at the age of 38. The cause was eventually determined to be pneumonia and heart complications, but the underlying cause was a life spent in the grinder of show business. When the news broke, a generation of fans mourned the loss of their first crush, But the grief was soon compounded by a shocking revelation. Corey Haim died completely destitute. He had no assets, no savings, no property. The estate of the man who had starred in some of the most iconic films of the 80s was valued at zero. In fact, he was so broke that his mother could not afford the cost of his funeral. The situation was so dire that the funeral home initially had to cover the expenses, and a fundraising site was set up by fans to help pay for the burial. Even his old friend Corey Feldman publicly stated he would not contribute to the funeral costs, citing their estranged relationship, which only highlighted the bitter, lonely reality of Haim's final days. He had given the world his youth, his innocence, and his talent, and in return, he died on a mattress in a shared apartment, with nothing to leave behind but a legacy of what could have been. His story is a brutal indictment of how we treat child stars. We consume their cuteness and discard their trauma. Corey Haim died penniless because the system that made him rich failed to protect him from the predators and the pitfalls that come with early fame. He was a casualty of an industry that values profit over people. But as we leave the tragedy of the lost boy behind, we must travel back to a time when men fought with their fists and the world listened on the radio. We are entering the boxing ring to meet a heavyweight champion, an American hero who knocked out Nazis in the ring, but found himself in a bout with the United States government that he simply could not win, forcing him to work as a greeter at a casino just to put food on the table.
Number 9. Joe Louis. The air inside a boxing arena is thick with a specific kind of electricity, a mix of sweat, cigar smoke, and the primal roar of thousands of men screaming for blood. In the center of that storm, standing calm and immovable like a statue carved from obsidian, was the Brown Bomber. Joe Louis was not merely a boxer, he was a monument to American strength in a time of global uncertainty. He held the heavyweight championship of the world for a record-breaking 12 years, defending his title 25 times, a feat that remains untouched in the annals of the sport. But his significance transcended the canvas. When he stepped into the ring against Max Schmeling at Yankee Stadium in 1938, he wasn't just fighting a man, he was fighting the ideology of Nazi Germany. He carried the hopes of a nation on his shoulders, destroying the myth of Aryan supremacy in 2 minutes and 4 seconds. For his efforts, Joe Louis was rewarded with a fortune that was staggering for the era. Over the course of his career, he earned an estimated $4.6 million. To put that into perspective, in the 1930s and 40s, a comfortable house cost a few $1,000s. Joe Louis was effectively a one-man economy. We watched him buy tailored suits, drive fast cars, and support a vast network of family and friends. We assumed that the man who had physically beaten the enemies of democracy was protected by the gratitude of his country. We assumed that the heavyweight champion of the world, the man who had generated millions in ticket sales and radio rights, was sitting on a mountain of gold that would last for generations. However, the reality was a slow, agonizing betrayal by the very system he had fought to defend. Joe Louis was a patriot. During World War II, he enlisted in the Army and fought nearly 100 exhibition matches to raise money for the relief funds. He donated his purses, hundreds of thousands of dollars, directly to the war effort. He paid for tickets for soldiers. He gave until it hurt. But in a twist of bureaucratic cruelty that is hard to stomach, the Internal Revenue Service decided that those donated purses were still taxable income. The government he had served sent him a bill for money he had given away to help win the war. It was a debt that started large and, with interest and penalties, grew into a monster that no amount of fighting could defeat.
The financial suffocation of Joe Louis was a public tragedy. By the time he retired from boxing, he was technically insolvent. The millions he had earned had been devoured by the IRS, by generosity that knew no bounds, and by managers who took advantage of his lack of financial literacy. He was a gladiator who knew how to handle himself in the ring, but outside of it, he was surrounded by sharks. The tax debt hung over him like a dark cloud, forcing him out of retirement and back into the ring when he was past his prime, just to pay the interest. We saw a shadow of the great champion, taking beatings from lesser men,
fighting simply to keep the government agents from seizing his home. It was a humiliating spectacle, a hero reduced to a commodity, selling his physical health for pennies on the dollar. By the 1960s and 70s, the Brown Bomber was a relic of a bygone era. The money was long gone. The investments had failed. The friends who had enjoyed his largesse had disappeared. He eventually found himself in Las Vegas, not as a high roller, but as an employee. He was hired by Caesar's Palace to work as a greeter. It is a haunting image, the greatest heavyweight of all time, the man who had once been the most famous person on earth, standing by the velvet ropes, shaking hands with tourists and posing for pictures for a paycheck. He was a living prop in a city built on losing. His health began to deteriorate under the stress and the years of physical punishment. He suffered from heart problems and struggles with drug addiction, coping mechanisms for the pain of a life that had spiraled out of his control. He was paranoid, convinced that there were plots against him, a mental decline exacerbated by the relentless pressure of his poverty. The man who had once been the symbol of American power was now powerless, a gentle giant trapped in a world that had used him up and discarded him. He was still beloved by the public, but love doesn't pay back taxes. The irony was bitter. The government that used his image to sell war bonds was the same entity that ensured he would die poor.
On April 12, 1981, Joe Louis passed away from cardiac arrest at the age of 66. The news of his death was a blow to the nation, a reminder of the glory days of boxing. But as the tributes poured in, the final accounting of his life revealed the depth of his financial ruin. The Brown Bomber, the man who had earned over $4 million, when that was a king's ransom, died completely broke. He had no estate to speak of. The IRS had taken everything. In a final twist that reads like a Hollywood script, his funeral was paid for not by the government he served, but by Max Schmeling, his former rival in the ring. The man the world had once called a Nazi stepped up to bury the American hero, because Joe's own country had left him with nothing. Joe Louis was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, a final salute that felt hollow given the way he had been treated in life. His story is a devastating critique of how we treat our heroes. We cheer for them when they are winning, but when the lights go down and the taxman comes calling, they are on their own. He fought for us, but we did not fight for him. He died a debtor to the nation he helped save. And so we leave the boxing ring and the bright lights of Caesar's Palace behind for the final time. We are heading to a hospital room in New York City, where a different kind of fighter is taking her last breath. She fought with a melody instead of a fist, a jazz icon whose voice was full of pain and beauty. But as the police stand guard outside her door, waiting to arrest a dying woman, we will find that the greatest singer of the century is about to leave this world with less than $1 to her name and a wad of cash strapped to her leg in a desperate final attempt to keep something for herself.
Number 10. Billie Holiday. The scent of antiseptic and stale coffee hangs heavy in the air of a grim hospital room in Harlem, a stark contrast to the gardenia perfume and cigarette smoke that once trailed the woman lying in the bed like a royal train. We have arrived at the final stop of our journey, and it is perhaps the most heartbreaking destination of them all. If jazz had a soul, it lived in the throat of Eleonora Fagan, known to the world as Billie Holiday, or simply Lady Day. She was more than a singer. She was an alchemist who could take the leaden weight of human suffering and spin it into gold. Her voice was a unique instrument, weary and wise, capable of expressing a depth of emotion that no technical proficiency could match. When she sang Strange Fruit in the darkened nightclubs of New York City, the clinking of glasses would stop, and the room would hold its breath, confronted by the brutal reality of racism in America. She was the queen of 52nd Street, a superstar who sold out Carnegie Hall, and whose recordings became the soundtrack for a generation of lovers and dreamers. In terms of cultural capital, Billie Holiday was one of the wealthiest women in the world. Her influence was incalculable. But in the cold, hard currency of the United States, she was a high-earning artist who saw millions of dollars pass through her hands. In today's money, her peak earnings would have placed her firmly in the upper echelon of the music industry. She wore mink coats, drove luxury cars, and commanded fees that should have secured her a life of comfort. We look at the photos of her in her prime, dripping in diamonds with that iconic white flower in her hair, and we see a woman in control, a diva who had conquered the world against impossible odds. We assume that the royalties from standards like God Bless the Child, a song she co-wrote about the necessity of having one's own money, would have ensured she never knew the sting of poverty again. However, the tragedy of Lady Day is that she was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the demons of her own addiction and another against a government that seemed determined to destroy her. She was targeted by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics with a ruthlessness reserved for public enemies, not artists. The relentless legal persecution drained her finances as quickly as she could earn them. Lawyers, bail money, and the exorbitant cost of maintaining a heroin addiction on the black market created a financial black hole. But the most devastating blow to her livelihood was the revocation of her cabaret card. Without it, she was legally barred from singing in any establishment that sold alcohol in New York City. The government had effectively cut off her primary source of income, silencing the voice that fed her, and forcing her to tour relentlessly in lesser venues just to survive.
The final years of Billie Holiday were a slow, agonizing slide into destitution. The system that surrounded her was predatory in the extreme. She was often paid in cash that disappeared before it ever reached a bank, siphoned off by abusive husbands, unscrupulous managers, and the hangers-on who preyed on her vulnerability. She was a woman who loved too hard and trusted too easily, often leaving her financial affairs in the hands of men who viewed her as a resource to be exploited rather than a partner to be cherished. The millions she generated for record labels and club owners did not trickle down to her. Instead, she was left to navigate a labyrinth of debt and dependency. As her liver began to fail, a consequence of years of drinking to numb the pain of her existence, her earning power vanished completely. The glamorous gowns were replaced by hospital johnnies. The adoring crowds were replaced by police officers stationed outside her door. Even as she lay dying in Metropolitan Hospital, suffering from advanced cirrhosis and heart failure, the authorities could not let her be. They raided her hospital room, claiming to find a small amount of narcotics, and placed her under arrest. It was a final, cruel act of humiliation. The woman who had given the world so much beauty was handcuffed to her deathbed, a prisoner of the state in her final moments. The isolation was absolute. The friends who had once filled her dressing room were gone. The lovers who had promised her the world had moved on to the next meal ticket. She was left alone with the wreckage of her life, a superstar reduced to a statistic. The physical decay was shocking. Her voice was a rasp, her body frail and withered, but the financial ruin was total. She had been stripped of her dignity, her freedom, and her fortune. The music industry continued to profit from her recordings, selling the pain she had lived, while the woman herself lay dying, worrying about how to pay for the roof over her head.
On July 17, 1959, the music stopped. Billie Holiday died at the age of 44. When the authorities and the hospital staff took inventory of what the legendary Lady Day had left behind, the numbers were a devastating indictment of the world that had used her. In her bank account, there was exactly 70 cents, less than $1 to show for a lifetime of brilliance. But the most heartbreaking detail was found on her person. Strapped to her leg, hidden beneath the covers, was a wad of cash totaling $750. It was a final, desperate attempt at security. In a life where everything had been taken from her, her childhood, her freedom, her money, her voice, she had tried to hold on to this one last tangible piece of survival. That $750 was likely intended for bail, or perhaps a funeral, or maybe just the comfort of knowing she wasn't completely empty-handed. She died gripping that cash, a woman who knew that in the end, the only person she could rely on was herself. The disparity is nauseating. 70 cents in the bank for the woman who enriched the soul of America. Her death marks the end of our dark tour through the hidden ledgers of Hollywood and the music industry. From the King of Pop to the Lady of the Gardenias, we have seen that the bright lights of fame often cast the longest shadows.
We have learned that a hit record or a box office smash is no shield against the cold mathematics of debt, addiction, and betrayal. These 10 icons generated billions of dollars, yet they died with empty pockets and heavy hearts. It serves as a chilling reminder that the image on the screen is often a mask, and that behind the glamour, the struggle for survival is as real for them as it is for anyone else. They gave us their art, their souls, and their lives. But in the end, the cost of fame was a price they paid with their last breath. The curtain falls here, but the echo of their stories, and the warning they provide, will resonate long after the applause has faded into silence.